It's been a huge day for Canadian basketball at the FIBA Basketball World Cup. The Canadians were trailing Spain in the fourth quarter, but came back to tie things up before taking the lead with just seconds left in what was a must-win game. Canada held on for an 88-85 victory, and that win sees the team advance to the quarterfinals of the tournament, where they'll be set to play Slovenia. But also importantly, the victory guarantees Canada a spot at the Paris Olympics next summer. The last time Canada qualified for the Olympics was in the year 2000. And for more on Team Canada's win and why it's so important, let's begin TSN's basketball reporter Josh Lundberg. Josh, thank you so much for joining us today. Such an exciting match. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts and feelings seeing the big moment.
Yeah, it was a big day. I mean, if you were listening closely Sunday morning, the sound you would have heard was the breathing of relief of a collective basketball nation, and the air show probably too. But yes, this is the first time in nearly 2.5 decades that Canada will be represented in men's basketball at the Olympics. And in that time, there's been a lot of disappointment and heartbreak. And honestly, I was having some deja vu. It seemed like this was following a familiar script where Canada goes into a tournament as the favorite with a lot of talent and expectations, and they steamroll their way through the early portions of the tournament. And then when things get real, they were on the cusp of collapse. They coughed up a very winnable game against Brazil the other day, and then they trailed Spain for most of this game. But that's when something different happened. That's when this group proved that they could get it done when they needed to get it done in the big moments. So yeah, this was a big day for long-suffering fans of the program.
And we do have a lot of avid basketball fans here in Canada. You broke down that game really well, so walk me through what Canada really needs to improve on as we head into the Olympics.
Well, the big question, I think, is going to be who's there, who's playing for this group. I give Canada a lot of credit because, as we've seen over past tournaments where things didn't go well towards the end, is in spite of all their talent, they were losing games to countries that had far more experience and continuity and chemistry. So what Canada did this time around is they said, all right, well, we're going to require a 3-year commitment from everybody, even NBA players, which was a bold ask considering how tough it is to ask some of these guys to give up big portions of their very short off seasons in 3 consecutive summers. But they got some commitments from some great players. And then this summer, they stuck to their guns, even when other NBA players that weren't able to participate last summer came calling and wanted to play. They said, well, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to stick with this group. It could have been criticized, I think, if things didn't work out. Then maybe we would have looked back on it and said, well, they could have used some of those guys. But in the end, you could really see that chemistry and continuity come through, especially during this comeback win towards the end when they showed that resiliency. But the big question is going to be next summer, going into the Olympics, if Andrew Wiggins comes calling or some of Canada's other best players that for whatever reason couldn't play this year, what's the answer going to be then? I think Canada, if they have their best players, they could put together one of the best rosters in the entire tournament, in the entire Olympics. Question is, who's going to play?
Well, that's my next question for you, actually, Josh. Do you think, considering this big win, considering they're heading to the Olympics, that a few of those notable names you mentioned will end up opting in before the deadline?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between committing to 3 years, which, as I said, is really tough for a lot of these guys for a lot of reasons in the NBA, where maybe they're playing for a contract, maybe they're a little bit banged up and recovering from an injury. 3 summers is a lot to commit to. 1 summer, when you know you're going to the Olympics, is a different story altogether. And I think for a lot of these guys who weren't on the roster this year, like, that's been a dream for them to compete in the Olympics. So it's going to be a tough decision for Canada basketball, for Rowan Barrett and for Jordi Fernandez to decide how many of the guys they're going to stick with here in this group. Remember, like, they owe something to these guys that gave up the last 2 summers and helped get them into a position where they do qualify. Is there enough loyalty there to stick with some of those guys instead of guys like Andrew Wiggins or Ben Mathurin, Shaden Sharp. You can go down the list. There are a lot of great Canadians in the NBA now, and I do think there's going to be a lot of interest. So it's a good problem to have if you're Canada basketball.
And you know what? You do bring up a good point there. Even we're getting ahead of ourselves. When we bring it back over to FIBA and the games going on ahead, how do you think Canada will actually fare against Slovenia in the quarterfinals?
Yeah, well, one of the many things I should say that Canada has had going for it so far in this tournament is that they're led by a superstar all-world talent in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. That makes a big difference in tournaments like this, knowing that in almost every game you're going to have the best player on the floor. And I say almost every game because I'm not sure that's going to be the case in the quarterfinals, going up against Slovenia, who, of course, are led by Luka Doncic, one of the best players in the world right now. So I think first and foremost, that's going to be a fun head-to-head matchup between Shai and Luka. But if you're Canada, you don't want it to come down to that matchup. One of the strengths of this Canadian team is they're more talented than Slovenia top to bottom. So against Spain, yeah, it was Shai towards the end. RJ Barrett got off to a good start. Dylan Brooks was great throughout, so I think you saw some of that depth, but guys like Kelly Olynyk really struggled. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who's important coming off the bench, he had a big three at the end, but he had a quiet game as well. Lou Dort was in foul trouble, so I really think some of these other guys need to step up and do their job to take some pressure off of Shai.
A lot of tough competition moving ahead. Josh Lewenberg with TSN Basketball, thank you so much for your advice.
Thanks, Eden.